My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 31 years old, and last Christmas taught me something I should have learned years earlier. Some people don't invite you to the table because they love you. They invite you so they can enjoy watching you sit there unwanted. At dinner, gift boxes kept sliding across the linen tablecloth one after another, each one wrapped with absurd care, each one open to applause, inside jokes, and those warm little speeches families give when they actually mean it. I waited longer than I should have. I even smiled longer than I should have. Then I made the mistake of asking the simplest question in the world. Is there one for me too? My father didn't even hesitate. He leaned back, rolled his eyes, and said, "Oh, please. You should be grateful we even let you sit at the table." My aunt laughed immediately. "Be glad we still remember your name." Everyone else followed, the kind of laughter that comes from people who think humiliation is harmless if it happens often enough. I remember the sound of silverware against crystal, the way nobody looked embarrassed, the way they all kept eating after that like I was just part of the entertainment. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just looked at him and said, "Good to know." Then I stayed long enough to make them comfortable again. That was the part I kept replaying later. Not the insult, not the laughter, but how easy it was for them, how practiced, how final it sounded. 2 months later, those same people were outside my house, pounding on my front door, shouting my name like suddenly it mattered. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Christmas dinner was held inside the Grand Monarch Station Hotel, a restored rail terminal turned luxury restaurant outside Milwaukee, all brass chandeliers, polished stone, and fake warmth. It was exactly the sort of place my father loved because it looked expensive enough to impress strangers and intimate enough to disguise cruelty. That night, when I finally sat down and started paying attention instead of hoping, I realized the gifts were not random. They were performances. My younger sister, Lauren Donovan, got diamond snowflake earrings and a speech about how she had always known how to carry herself with grace. My aunt, Denise Harper, received a custom leather planner monogrammed in gold because, according to my father, nobody keeps this family organized like Denise. My uncle, Victor Harper, got a vintage whiskey decanter and a joke about how he was the only man in the family who still understood loyalty. Even Lauren's boyfriend got cufflinks because he was, in my father's words, the kind of man who knows how to build something. Then there was me. No gift, no envelope, not even a joke package meant to soften the insult. Just nothing. It would have been less cruel if they had forgotten. But they hadn't forgotten. They had planned absence for me. Robert Donovan, my father, had spent most of my life treating approval like a prize you earn by becoming someone easier for him to brag about. He liked glossy success. He liked people he could summarize in one sentence at a country club table. Lauren fit that image. She worked in luxury residential sales, dressed beautifully, smiled on cue, and never challenged him in public. I was the daughter with steel-toe boots in my trunk, code manuals in my office, and a career most people didn't understand until they needed a building declared safe. I was a fire protection engineer. I spent my days reviewing evacuation systems, sprinkler layouts, smoke control failures, occupancy loads, and the 1,000 invisible details that keep panic from becoming tragedy. My father used to mock that too. "My daughter checks hallways and ceiling pipes for a living," he once told a group at brunch, smiling like he'd said something adorable. He never mentioned that developers, insurers, attorneys, and city inspectors called me when millions of dollars depended on whether a building could legally open its doors. At dinner, after the laughter died down, Lauren gave me one of those brittle little smiles people use when they want credit for not joining in too loudly. Denise sipped her wine and asked whether I was still doing those boring safety reports. Victor said, "That sounds about right for Claire. She's always had a talent for telling people what could go wrong." Robert raised his glass and said, "At least she finally found a career where pessimism pays." More laughter. I looked around that table and realized something ugly. Nobody there expected me to defend myself, because every year I had trained them not to. Every year, I took the smaller chair, the lighter insult, the afterthought invitation, and told myself family required endurance. That night, I noticed details I had ignored before. My father had seated me at the far end near the service station, practically behind a pillar. The place card with my name was handwritten on a different cardstock than the others, like someone added me late. The waiter asked twice whether I was with the party. Nobody corrected him quickly. That is the thing about disrespect when it becomes tradition. It starts looking casual. I left after dessert without making a scene. Not because I was weak, because clarity had finally replaced hurt. I walked through that decorated hotel lobby past the giant Christmas tree and the couples taking photos, and the violinist near the staircase. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel rejected. I felt informed. I sat in my car for 15 minutes with the engine off and my hands on the wheel, replaying only one sentence. Good to know. Not because it sounded clever, because it was true. Good to know what I was to them. Good to know what I was not. Good to know exactly how little they thought they'd lose if they kept treating me like a placeholder in my own family. What none of them understood was that I had already spent nearly a year helping my father in ways he barely appreciated and absolutely did not deserve. He had been trying to open a high-end wedding venue in a converted lakeside mill called Windermere House. The project was drowning in permit delays, inspection corrections, occupancy restrictions, and insurance demands. He liked to tell people he built it himself. That was a lie. For 10 months, I had reviewed contractor submittals at midnight, rewritten fire egress plans, flagged hazardous decorative materials, corrected non-compliant banquet layouts, and personally introduced him to people in my professional network who were willing to take his calls because I made them believe the project could still be salvaged. I never asked to be paid. I told myself I was helping family. Christmas showed me what family meant to them. And by New Year's Day, I made the first quiet change they never saw coming. I did not wake up the next morning and become a different woman. That would make a cleaner story, but it wouldn't be true. The first week after Christmas, I was angry in the ordinary ways. I ignored calls. I let texts sit unanswered. I stared at family photos on my phone and started deleting them one by one. Not in a dramatic purge, in a methodical sequence. A lake trip where Robert had praised Lauren for lighting up every room while asking whether I could move the folding chairs because I was better with logistics. Delete. A birthday dinner where Denise told me I would be prettier if I smiled with my teeth less. Delete. The groundbreaking photo at Windermere House where everyone held ceremonial shovels except me, even though the corrected safety package in Robert's hand was my work. Delete. There was something cleansing about naming each memory before removing it. Not because I wanted amnesia, because I wanted accuracy. If I was going to decide whether these people still belonged in my life, I needed to stop romanticizing what had actually happened. My best friend, Tessa Brooks, came over one Friday night with Thai food and enough brutal honesty to save me from self-deception. Tessa had known me since college and hated my family with a restraint that deserved awards. She sat cross-legged on my couch, watched me delete another photo, and said, "You know what's wild? They keep hurting you because they think you'll always confuse loyalty with availability." I laughed once, the kind that sounds like you are almost crying but too tired to commit. She wasn't wrong. Robert never called to ask how I was unless he needed a consultant's opinion disguised as daughterly support. Denise loved to introduce me as the smart one, in that chilly tone people use when intelligence is both compliment and accusation. Victor only remembered my number when an insurance form confused him. Lauren was the hardest one to understand because she was never openly vicious for long. She specialized in passive permission. She watched the cruelty happen and adjusted her smile depending on who else was in the room. A week into January, Robert sent me an email instead of texting. It had no apology. The subject line read, "Quick code question." That told me everything. He attached revised floor diagrams for Windermere House and wanted to know whether increasing banquet capacity in the main reception hall would raise any issues before his lender's final review. I stared at that message for a full minute. No mention of Christmas, no acknowledgement of humiliation, no "how have you been?" Just work, just extraction. Just the old assumption that I would step over my own dignity because he had a deadline. I drafted 3 responses and deleted all of them. Then I called the attorney who had helped me set up my consulting practice and asked a very simple question. If a client keeps using my prior work product, introductions, and implied support after our relationship is over, what is the cleanest way to separate professionally? The answer was both boring and beautiful. Written notice. Clear limits. No emotion in the document. No accusations you can't prove. No family language. Just boundaries. 2 days later, Robert received a formal withdrawal notice from my firm. It stated that effective immediately, I was no longer reviewing, endorsing, consulting on, or permitting the use of my name, analyses, prior correspondence, or recommendations for Wintermere House or any affiliated project. It also required that all parties copied on past coordination emails be informed that I was not the engineer of record, not the life safety approver, and not available for further clarification. I sent it to Robert, his general contractor, the project manager, the architect, the lender's risk consultant, and the insurance broker who had been leaning heavily on my informal reassurance that the venue could eventually satisfy pre-opening requirements. I did not accuse anyone of fraud. I did not threaten anyone. I just removed the one thing my father had been counting on without ever valuing: my credibility. That single email changed the trajectory of his project within 48 hours. Questions that had been postponed suddenly returned. The lender wanted a third-party review before releasing another construction draw. The insurer refused to finalize binders until a new life safety consultant certified corrective actions. The architect, who had tolerated Robert mostly because of me, stopped taking his late-night calls. The decorative installation company had to remove imported drapery fabrics after someone, probably the building official, but I never asked, flagged flame spread issues I had previously warned Robert about. Then the city scheduled a follow-up inspection and found that the upstairs bridal suite corridor had been narrowed by millwork changes that reduced egress clearance below what had been approved. Small problems by themselves, expensive problems together. Catastrophic problems if your entire business model depends on launching in spring wedding season. Robert still did not apologize. Instead, he called and left a voicemail that began, "I don't know what game you think you're playing." That message was followed by a text from Denise saying, "This is childish. You know how much your father has invested." Victor sent, "Family doesn't do this to family." Lauren waited longer, then texted, "Can we talk? Dad's really stressed." That one almost got me, not because it was sincere, but because it exposed the hierarchy perfectly. Christmas humiliation for me, emergency empathy for him. I looked at that screen and finally asked myself the question I should have asked years earlier. If my family doesn't need me as a person, why should they still have access to me as a resource? By February, the damage had widened. A regional wedding planner quietly paused referrals to Wintermere House after hearing the opening date was unstable. A corporate event client withdrew an inquiry deposit because Robert couldn't guarantee occupancy certification. The bank requested updated cost projections, and those numbers were ugly. He had counted on a smooth finish because he thought he still owned my labor. He didn't. I had not attacked him. I had simply stopped saving him. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning near the end of February, my video doorbell lit up with 3 familiar faces and one terrified truth. They had finally figured out what I had taken away. Robert Donovan stood on my front porch in a wool overcoat that probably cost more than my first car, pounding on the door like force could reopen access to my life. Denise was beside him, hair pinned perfectly despite the wind, already looking offended by my silence. Victor kept scanning the street as if public embarrassment might still be negotiable. Lauren stood slightly behind them, pale and restless, hugging her arms against the cold. They had driven a little over 3 hours from Lake Geneva to my place in Grand Rapids, because the phone calls I didn't answer had run out, and the project timeline was collapsing faster than Robert's pride could manage. My doorbell camera caught every word. "Claire," he shouted, "we need to talk. Please open up." The please sounded like it had been dragged across broken glass. Denise stepped closer and said, "This has gone far enough." Victor added, "We're not leaving until you come out here." Then Robert slammed his palm against my door again and yelled, "You're destroying this family over a joke at Christmas." That sentence actually made me laugh. I didn't open immediately. I made coffee first. I stood in my kitchen, barefoot on heated tile, listening to them through the speaker with an almost clinical calm. 2 months earlier, I had sat at a table and learned what I was worth to them when they believed they held all the power. Now they were discovering something equally educational. Contempt gets expensive when you direct it at the wrong person. I checked the time, finished pouring my coffee, and only then opened the door. But not all the way. Just enough to look at them without inviting them in. Robert started talking before I said a word. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped. "The lender is freezing our draw. The insurer is demanding a new consultant. People think there's some kind of major safety issue." I leaned against the frame and said, "There are several safety issues. I wrote about them repeatedly." Denise cut in, "Don't be smart." I looked at her and said, "That's one of the things you've all hated most about me, isn't it? That I'm useful in ways you can't control." Lauren flinched. Victor muttered, "This isn't helping." But Robert was too wound up to slow down. "You didn't have to humiliate us like this," he said, voice shaking with anger. That was the moment something in me turned from hurt to ice. "Humiliate you?" I repeated. "At Christmas dinner, you looked me in the face in front of everyone and told me I should be grateful you let me sit at the table. Denise said I should be glad you all still remembered my name. You all laughed. Then, in January, you emailed me a code question like none of that happened. So let's not use the word humiliate like it belongs only to you." His jaw tightened. Denise folded her arms. "We were teasing," she said, with that same old family defense tone that had excused 1,000 cuts. "No," I said. "You were measuring. You wanted to remind me where I stood." Victor tried a softer angle. "Claire, your father's under a lot of pressure. If this project fails, he loses a fortune." I took a sip of coffee and answered, "Then he should have treated the person holding the matches with a little more respect." None of them spoke for a second, not because the line was dramatic, because it was true. Robert lowered his voice then, probably deciding rage was not working. "What do you want?" he asked. There it was. The question underneath every interaction we had ever had. Not, "How are you?" Not, "What do you need to heal?" Just terms, access, transaction. I looked past him to the black SUV idling at the curb and said, "I wanted a family. That option expired." Lauren finally stepped forward. "Claire, please," she said quietly. "Dad's been a mess. The bank says if the March review doesn't clear, they can call part of the note. Denise has been trying to find another consultant, but nobody wants to inherit the file this late. We just need your help one more time." I turned to her and almost felt sorry. Almost. "One more time," I said. That phrase built this whole disaster. Robert tried to reclaim authority. "You're my daughter." I answered, "Exactly. Not your unpaid contingency plan." Denise's composure cracked. "You're really doing this over hurt feelings?" she asked. "Over hurt feelings?" I repeated. "No, I'm doing this over a lifetime of being treated like a utility. Christmas was just the first time I stopped pretending not to notice." Victor looked at Lauren, maybe hoping she could still reach me. But Lauren made the mistake of saying the thing she'd probably rehearsed in the car. "Dad compared you to me because he wanted you to push yourself." I stared at her. "No, Lauren. Dad compared me to you because he knew I'd keep coming back, and you'd keep benefiting from it." That landed harder than anything else I'd said so far. Lauren's face changed first. Then Robert's. Then Denise's eyes narrowed with the realization that I was no longer here to perform forgiveness so they could get through a difficult quarter. I opened the door a little wider, stepped onto the porch, and let the February wind hit all of us equally. "You drove 3 hours to ask for help," I said. "Fine, let's talk. But you're going to hear the whole thing this time, not the edited version that protects your comfort." I didn't invite them inside. I stood on the porch while they remained in the cold, which felt appropriate considering how many winters of mine they had spent unbothered. Robert kept glancing over my shoulder like maybe warmth and control were still available if he pushed hard enough. They weren't. "You all want to make this about Wintermere House," I said, "but that venue is just the invoice. The bill came due years ago." Denise scoffed under her breath, and I ignored her. Do you remember my senior awards dinner? I asked Robert. You told your friends Lauren was the social one, and I was the one who made rooms feel like homework. Do you remember the lake house weekend when Victor asked whether I'd ever learn to dress like a woman who enjoyed being seen? Do you remember forwarding my engineering license announcement to the family thread with the message, I guess at least one of my kids can read contracts? Robert started to interrupt. I raised a hand. No, you're going to listen. That's the cost of standing on my porch. Victor stared at the driveway. Denise looked furious. Lauren looked sick. Good. For once, the discomfort was distributed correctly. You all keep calling Christmas a joke, I continued. Let's talk about jokes. Jokes are funny because everyone can survive them. What happened at that table wasn't a joke. It was a public reminder that I rank below your approval, below appearances, below the fantasy version of family you perform for other people. The reason you're here now is not because you understand that. You're here because removing me from Wintermere House hurt you in a language you respect. Money, deadlines, reputation. That's the first honest thing to happen between us in years. Robert inhaled sharply and said, You're being dramatic. I smiled without warmth. You want dramatic? Here's dramatic. The lender's risk consultant called me last week to confirm I was no longer affiliated. He asked whether my withdrawal was due to unresolved life safety concerns. I told him I would not characterize a client matter beyond my written notice. Do you understand what that did? It forced them to assume the most conservative interpretation. That's what professionals do when certainty disappears. They tighten. They delay. They protect themselves. That's why your jaw froze. Robert went still. He had not known that part. Denise looked at him, then back at me. You could fix this, she said. Maybe, I replied. Technically, maybe. Personally, no. Then Robert said the thing I think he thought would finally put me back in my place. Your sister would never do this. There it was. The old comparison, dragged out like a lucky knife. But it was too late. No, I said. Lauren would never do this because Lauren was never asked to survive being treated like disposable labor inside her own family. Lauren got praise, jewelry, opportunities, introductions, and grace. I got usefulness. You don't compare us because she's better. You compare us because it lets you keep failing me without naming it. Lauren whispered, That's not fair. I looked at her. Neither was any of it. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I did something I had planned only in fragments until that second. I reached into the folder I had brought to the door and pulled out 4 copies of a document. What is that? Victor asked. Your answer, I said. Each packet contained a personal no-contact notice drafted by my attorney, not some dramatic court order, just a formal instruction that future communication with me was limited to documented channels and only for unresolved business records related to prior project correspondence. It also stated that I was declining any future personal invitations, family gatherings, and informal requests for professional advice. Not because I was having a moment, because I was done. I handed one to Robert first. His face went pale with a kind of anger that finally had nowhere to go. Denise refused to take hers until Lauren quietly pressed it into her hand. Victor read his and actually looked embarrassed. Robert crumpled the first page halfway and barked, You can't be serious. I met his eyes. I have never been more serious in my life. Denise snapped, So that's it? You're throwing us away? No, I said. I'm returning what you handed me. You all spent years showing me exactly where I stood. Christmas was just the moment you said it plainly enough that I could stop lying to myself. This, I tapped the folder, is me accepting your terms. Lauren started crying then, but even that didn't move me the way it once would have. Not because I'm cruel, because timing matters. Tears after consequences are not the same as care before them. Claire, she said, voice shaking, I didn't know it was this bad. I answered her honestly. That's because it was never bad enough to inconvenience you. She covered her mouth. Robert looked at me like I had become someone else entirely. The truth was simpler than that. I had become visible to myself. He shifted tactics again, desperation finally outrunning ego. If the bank calls the note, he said quietly, I could lose Wintermere. The house is tied into the guarantee structure. Denise put money in too. Victor brought in investors. This doesn't just hurt me. I let that sit there. That was the first thing he'd said all morning that sounded remotely like truth rather than authority. Then maybe the lesson will travel, I said. Maybe next time you'll remember that people you humiliate in private or public do not remain soft forever. Maybe next time you won't assume being needed makes someone owned. He looked older suddenly. Smaller, somehow. For a split second, I saw the version of him I used to chase, the father I kept hoping lived somewhere underneath the performance. But he had brought 3 people to my door to pressure me into saving his investment after a lifetime of using affection like leverage. I was not going to reward that with reconciliation that existed only to restore convenience. He asked one final question. So what are you saying? That was when everything inside me became very still. I looked at each of them in turn, Robert, Denise, Victor, Lauren, and said, Today, I'm not asking you for an apology. I'm not negotiating one more chance. I just need you to understand what you've already lost. You didn't lose me this morning. You lost me at Christmas. Today is simply the first day you were forced to notice. Nobody moved after that. The wind dragged dead leaves along the edge of the porch, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice, absurdly normal against the collapse happening in front of me. Robert stared at me as though he believed there was still one sentence, one command, one guilt-laced reminder of blood that could pull me back into orbit. Denise was the first to recover. You are punishing everyone because you're too sensitive to handle family banter, she said, clutching the notice in a manicured hand. You always did make everything heavier than it had to be. In the past, that line might have hooked into an old bruise. On that porch, it sounded like background noise. No, I said. What makes things heavy is repetition, pattern, entitlement. A one-time insult is a wound. A lifelong pattern is architecture. You all built this. I'm simply no longer living inside it. Victor tried a last-ditch appeal to practicality. Look, say your piece, fine, but don't let emotion wreck what could still be fixed. That word again, emotion. As if men like Victor had not built entire lives on anger, pride, and hierarchy, then relabeled women's boundaries as irrational the minute those boundaries cost them something. I stepped down one porch stair so we were nearly eye level. You all keep talking like Wintermere House is the tragedy, I said. It isn't. A delayed venue can be refinanced, reworked, sold, or foreclosed. Painful, yes. Fatal? No. The tragedy is that the only thing strong enough to make this family hear me was financial exposure, not tears, not distance, not years, not humiliation, money. Lauren wiped her face and whispered, I'm sorry. This time, I believed she meant it, at least partially, but sincerity and sufficiency are not the same thing. I know you might be, I told her. But I'm still leaving. Robert finally took a step forward, voice rougher now, less controlled. Claire, don't do this. Don't turn one terrible holiday into something permanent. I almost admired the framing, one terrible holiday, as if Christmas had manufactured the problem instead of revealing it. It's permanent because it was consistent, I said. Christmas was just the clearest example. You made me the family convenience. The problem solver you could disrespect because you assumed competence meant durability. You all kept asking what was wrong with me when the real question was, what was wrong with the arrangement? Then I gave him the part I knew he would hate most because it was factual, not emotional. I documented everything on the project, I said. Every warning, every code concern, every instance where I advised delay and you pushed speed. Every time I corrected something after hours because you promised the contractors a timeline before confirming compliance. If anyone asks whether I acted properly in withdrawing, I'm covered. Professionally, legally, ethically. So if you came here hoping pressure, volume, or family guilt would make me reverse course, save the gas money next time. Robert's expression cracked then, not into remorse, not fully, but into fear. Real fear. The kind that arrives when a person realizes the other party prepared for the moment he assumed would never happen. Denise looked at the folder again and asked, softer now. So there's really nothing we can say? I answered with more honesty than she deserved. You could have said it years ago. You could have said it at dinner. You could have said it in January before the permits, before the lender review, before this porch. You could have said, Claire, we were cruel, and we know it wasn't teasing. We keep using you, and we need to change. But you didn't. You came here because something expensive started breaking. She lowered her eyes. That tiny motion satisfied me more than I expected. Robert was breathing harder than before. You're my daughter, he said again, but now it sounded less like authority and more like a plea he didn't know how to shape. That should mean something. I nodded once. It does. That's why this hurts. But being your daughter does not require me to remain available for my own erasure. I let the silence sit. Then I said the sentence I think will stay with me for the rest of my life. Respect is not a holiday gift. It is the minimum price of admission to my life. He closed his eyes for half a second. Lauren started crying quietly again. Victor rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly fascinated by my mailbox. Denise looked like someone had finally held a mirror where she expected a service. For one strange, suspended moment, none of them were powerful. They were just people standing in the cold, learning that access to me had always been a privilege they mistook for a right. I handed Robert one last sheet from the folder. It wasn't legal. It was personal. A single page with bullet points, dates, events, quotes, and the direct consequences I remembered. Christmas dinner, the wedding venue groundbreaking, the awards dinner, the family brunch comments. Each one followed by a short line. What I learned from this. I am welcome only when I am useful. At the bottom, I had written, do not contact me to debate my memory. Live with yours. He read the first half and stopped. His hand shook once. I don't know whether it was anger, shame, or the shock of seeing years of casual cruelty arranged in black and white. Probably all three. Then I stepped back up onto the porch. This conversation is over, I said. If a records issue comes up on the project, your attorney can contact mine. Anything else will be ignored. Robert looked like he wanted to say more, but whatever remained in him had finally met a locked door. Denise turned first. Victor followed. Lauren lingered long enough to mouth, I am sorry, and I gave her the mercy of a nod, but not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Robert stayed 1 second longer than the others. You'll regret this, he said, though even he no longer sounded convinced. I looked at him and said, no, I'll grieve it. That's different. Then I went inside and closed the door. They kept standing there for another minute. I watched from the side window without letting them see me. Robert put one hand on the porch railing like he needed it. Denise touched his arm and he pulled away. Victor said something sharp. Lauren turned toward the car with both hands covering her face. The four of them had come to retrieve a daughter, a niece, a consultant, a safety net, a clean solution. They left with paperwork, silence, and a 3-hour drive back to the consequences of underestimating me. I wish I could tell you they changed overnight. They didn't. Real consequences are rarely cinematic once the door closes. They're slower than that. More humiliating. More expensive. 2 weeks after the porch confrontation, I heard through a former project contact that Wintermere House missed its lender review and lost its preferred financing terms. The opening was delayed indefinitely. One investor pulled out. Another demanded a restructuring. Robert had to list a lake property he once bragged would stay in the family forever. Denise's contribution was tied up long enough to derail the boutique expansion she had been planning. Victor, who had guaranteed part of a vendor package through a side entity, had to explain some very awkward numbers to people he cared deeply about impressing. None of that happened because I sabotaged them. It happened because I stopped cushioning their recklessness with unpaid labor and credibility they never respected until it disappeared. Lauren sent me 2 handwritten letters over the next month. Not texts, not emojis, actual letters. The first was mostly grief. The second was better. Specific. Accountable. She named moments she had benefited from my silence. She admitted she had hidden behind being the easy daughter, while I absorbed the role of difficult, useful, overreacting Claire. I did not answer right away, but I kept both letters. That mattered. Denise never wrote. Victor sent one email through his attorney asking whether a prior code memo could be clarified for records. It went to my attorney, exactly as instructed. Robert sent nothing directly after the day on my porch. Silence, from him, was the closest thing to respect I had ever received. And me? I slept better. Not immediately, but steadily. The first week felt strange, like stepping out of a building after years inside stale air. I kept reaching for my phone with the old reflex to explain myself, smooth things over, restore peace I had never actually been allowed to share in. Then the impulse faded. I took work I had postponed. I traveled for a courthouse renovation review in Boston and realized, somewhere between site visits and room service coffee, that nobody had mocked my job in weeks. Nobody had asked me a technical question without also asking how I was. Nobody had turned competence into obligation. Peace can feel unfamiliar when chaos has been calling itself family for years. A month later, Tessa came over with takeout again and asked whether I thought I had been too hard on them. I considered it honestly because that question deserves honesty. No, I said. I think I was late. That's the part I want anyone listening to understand. Leaving doesn't always mean slamming a door in rage. Sometimes it means looking at the blueprint of your life and admitting a structure is unsound, no matter who built it. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not humiliation, screaming, or public exposure. Sometimes it is refusing to keep donating your intelligence, time, tenderness, labor, and access to people who keep proving they only value those things once they can no longer reach them. The lesson I carried out of that Christmas was not that family doesn't matter. It's that family without respect becomes theater, and somebody always gets cast as the sacrifice. For years, I thought endurance made me good. I thought understanding people's flaws made me noble. I thought being useful would eventually earn me safety. It didn't. Boundaries did. Distance did. Documentation did. Saying no without leaving the sentence open for negotiation did. I did not need my father to agree that I was wounded in order to stop the bleeding. I did not need my aunt to approve my memory for it to be true. I did not need my sister's delayed grief to continue offering myself as the bridge everyone crossed while pretending I was difficult terrain. So that is what happened 2 months after my father left me out at Christmas. He came to my house expecting access, pressure, and maybe one more rescue. Instead, he learned the difference between being related to someone and being entitled to them. He learned that the daughter he treated like an afterthought had quietly become the only adult in the room who understood consequences from the beginning. And he learned it too late. If there's one thing I want to leave with you, it's this. When the people closest to you keep making you feel invisible, walking away is not cruelty. It is self-respect in motion. You do not have to stay where you are only remembered when you are needed. You do not have to forgive on demand to prove you are good. And you do not have to keep sitting at a table that serves everyone else your dignity piece by piece. Sometimes the most educational, most necessary, most life-saving thing you can do is become unavailable to those who only valued your presence after your absence started costing them. If you were in my place, would you stay or would you leave? Comment just one sentence. I'd leave or I'd stay. From my point of view, this story is not just about revenge. It's about finally seeing the truth after years of quiet disrespect. What hit me the most was that Claire didn't explode right away. She simply stopped allowing people to use her while pretending they were family. That made her decision feel stronger, smarter, and more meaningful. Sometimes the most powerful response is not anger, but distance and self-respect. What about you? If your own family treated you like this for years, would you forgive them? Or would you walk away for good?